All right, so we are going to be in Revelation chapter 14 tonight. So I'll give you just a minute to turn there. Revelation 14. Now, it's been a couple of weeks since we've gotten together. Last time we got together in chapter 13, you might remember the main focus was this vision of Rome as a beast that comes up out of the water, a seven-headed beast coming up out of the water and oppressing and making war against God's people. And all the people of the world seemingly declaring their allegiance to the beast, so much so they're willing to kind of mark themselves as the beast, sort of almost parody the image of God. They take the beast's image and put it on themselves. And so we talked about that for a little while last week and what it meant. That the main focus of that chapter was sort of Rome and the way that it was persecuting the Christians, but more broadly, the way that big world powers aligned to try to oppose God's will, but do so unsuccessfully. And so after last week, we had this mostly kind of negative vision of the beast coming up and making war with God's people. We now go to a series of three new visions, sort of come back to back in this chapter. There's three of them that are visions about victory and reward and vindication. You probably noticed by now Revelation likes to go back and forth between these different like images of warning and images of comfort, and juxtapose the two. So bad times are going to happen, but it'll all be okay, and put those back to back. And we talked about how those typically aren't like one after the other events for the book of Revelation. That Revelation thinks history has a trajectory, but a lot of times the images we get in Revelation don't always have a super neat, like a temporal relationship to one another. That Revelation is sort of giving us images of a small number of events over and over from different perspectives. And that's what's going on really here tonight. The three visions that we're going to get here in this chapter are not necessarily like three things that will happen in this order in the future. They're not really predictive about this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. They're three images of the same thing, just shown to us using different metaphors. It kind of makes me think of like seeing three paintings in a gallery by the same painter. That you might have three paintings put on a wall going left to right by one painter, but you don't necessarily assume that those pictures go together to tell a story. But you would be very right in assuming they probably share similar ideas. And that's what's happening here. We're going to see three visions of the same scene. And the scene is God's people achieving victory and reward and vindication. These things being given to the people who stay faithful and don't give in to the world and its demands of the Christians. The big theme of tonight's chapter that I think will help us if we keep this in mind as we go through the whole thing is God's fairness, I think, is what it makes the most sense to say we're going to talk about, is God's ultimate fairness. These visions are an assurance that God wins, not the world, not the beast. And when God wins, God will remember all the good that's taken place and all the bad that's taken place and respond accordingly to that at the end of history. So let's take a look, starting in Revelation 14:1. And I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on the Mount Zion. And with him were 144,000 who had his name on and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they sing a new song before the throne, and before the four living creatures, and before the elders. No one could learn that song except for the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgin. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They have been redeemed from humankind as the first fruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouths, no lie was found. They are blameless. So, first vision we get here, and it has a couple little weirder parts to it. After seeing this image of, in the last chapter, this beast that comes up out of the water, and all the people start worshiping the beast like the beast is Christ, like the dragon Satan is God. Now John looks and he sees, kind of opposite this scene, the Lamb from heaven standing on Mount Zion. That's, you probably know, the mountain that Jerusalem is on. Um, and with him are 144,000 people gathered, singing songs. And it says a couple of things about him that are interesting, but we'll pause here for a moment. The image here is kind of that of a gathered military, is I think the best way to kind of understand what John is seeing. That he looks up and he sees a huge army prepared for battle, is basically what this is. The overall image kind of reminds me of in the second Lord of the Rings movie, in the Two Towers, at the Battle of Helm's Deep. Remember, there's a scene where all the heroes think that it's over, that the orcs are going to overrun the city, and then the sun breaks and look out, and far away they see a second army's coming through, that Gandalf's brought this other army in, and now the orcs are just absolutely dismayed. That's kind of what happens here, that John is seeing these Christians being, beaten down by the beast, and wonders if it's all over for him, when suddenly he sees the Lamb with 144,000 soldiers ready for battle. And the fact that they're singing is a sign of victory, that a gathered group with the Lamb we would associate with, like, they're singing a victory song here. It's kind of pulling an image from Psalm 2, that if you were to look at Psalm 2 in your Bible, you would see it talks about God taking his Messiah, his anointed one, and fixing him on Mount Zion for all the world to see. And Psalm 2 is about God kind of showing his superiority over the nations. It's the one that has that verse about the nations plot in vain and God laughs at them. So he looks up and he sees this group of kind of soldiers, 144,000 of them, singing songs of victory and coronation. And not only that, but these sort of exclusive songs, that it's songs that hadn't been heard before, that nobody was able to know except the Lamb. So it's sort of got this in-group thing for it, where they're united around this sort of secret song that only they know, but it's a song proclaiming the Lamb's victory. And you probably notice that it says that he has these 144,000 have the Father's name written on their the Lamb's name and the Father's name written on their foreheads. And that's a pretty clear, it'd be clear if we read this last week, you'd have caught right away that this is a counterpoint to the mark of the beast that we talked about last time, right? The beast's followers have the mark of the beast that they take on their forehead, but the Lamb's followers have the Lamb's name and the Father's name on their forehead. It's like we talked about last time. This mark is not like a temporary, like a tattoo that any group's gotten, on a whim or anything like that, but to be marked for the beast or marked for Christ means to be devoted to them totally, that you've chosen which thing you're going to serve. You can either be one of the beast's people or one of Christ's people, and these are the people that have marked themselves as Christ's people. Probably one of the strangest lines is that it says these 144,000 have not defiled themselves with women since they remained virgins. It's an odd little note, but there's, I think, two main images going there that are kind of being pulled from the Old Testament. One is that in the prophets, the major and the minor prophets, and it shows up in like the history books too, you might remember that adultery is a really common metaphor for idolatry, that books like Hosea, but a lot more than that, but Hosea kind of most famously talk about God and Israel as being like a husband and wife, and Israel's worshiping foreign idols as being like the wife of this relationship committing adultery against the husband. And so the counterpoint to that is sometimes in the Bible, especially when you're in like a really symbolic area like this, virginity or just sort of sexual purity can then also be a metaphor for faithfulness. So that's one thing here. But the other thing here is that Israel had a tradition, and I believe this shows up in Deuteronomy in the law. I know it shows up in Samuel as a command. Israel had a tradition that before battle, before war, the men going to war would not have sex with their wives for a set amount of time. There was sort of a prescribed period of chastity for the married soldiers before the battle. And that was just a sort of way of dedicating a certain amount of time to God before the battle went. You might recall when David knows Bathsheba is pregnant and he's trying to get her husband killed. He first tries to get him to come back from the battlefield and spend the night with Bathsheba, and he refuses because of this rule. You might remember that story. He says, "No, I can't. We're at the field. I can't do that right now." So that's kind of what's going on here, is that these 144,000 are ready for battle. Um, so they're here kind of standing over the Christians that are being persecuted. It's like, the Christians think that the beast is going to overtake them, and they see this massive army. 144,000, that number has shown up a few times in the book of Revelation, always representing like a mass of faithful Christians in heaven. We talked about the numbers kind of significant, that's 12 12s times 1,000. So it's a massive crowd. It's sometimes symbolic of everybody in heaven, like it was back in chapter 7, I believe. But here it's interesting. You get this massive crowd that before we kind of associated with the entirety of heaven, but then we're told that that's only the first fruit. So you see this massive army that's going to overtake the beast, ready to protect you. Well, that's only the first portion of it. That's the first fruit of it. So it's again an image in Revelation where very often the number of faithful is often, I think, thought to probably be by the end of time bigger significantly than the number that follow the beast. That this enormous crowd, this 12 of 12 times of thousands, is just a taste of the actual forces that heaven has. So that's the first image here, is this kind of army gathered singing songs of victory, ready to protect the people that the beast is trying to persecute. But the image turns to sort of the counterpoint of that in the next one. So starting in verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water." Then another angel, a second, followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." Then another angel called out in a loud voice, "Those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their forehead or on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger, and they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no day or night for those who worship the beast and its name, and for anyone who receives his mark. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith in Jesus." So we get, actually 13, I missed one verse of this. "And then I heard a voice from heaven saying, 'Write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes,' says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, and their deeds follow them." So we get this second vision where three angels flying in the middle of heaven, so probably the idea is like the sky, come and pronounce God's coming judgment over evildoers. This is interesting. We start off within this vision. John sees the gospel being proclaimed to every person on the earth. So he sees this angel come and proclaim the gospel to everyone of every nation and tribe and language and people. And the angel points out, especially God as creator, that the creator of the world is calling out and demanding a response from the people. And we can talk about this later, but a thing that always interests me in Revelation is that in passages like this, Revelation doesn't ever imagine somebody going through their whole life and not ever encountering God or hearing the gospel or having an ability to choose. Revelation really sees all peoples falling into these categories where everybody has either consciously accepted Christ or consciously rejected Christ. And again, there's a lot of different things we could do or say about that and what that means. But at least for the point of the image here, everyone on earth in this picture that we have has heard the gospel and has either said yes or no to it. And then after this proclamation, after everyone in the world knows what the stakes are and what's happening, another angel comes out and says, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Just an interesting thing. I don't really know why, but the Revelation does a few times is use one of the images that it will introduce later, and this is one of them. So, like, the beast showed up in one verse a chapter before the beast came up out of the sea. And here we get something similar with this woman, this prostitute, as she'll be called later, Babylon, that's being judged by God. That image is going to come up later. That the beast is going to become, the same entity becomes in a few chapters the whore of Babylon, being the sort of image you remember from the old King James. So what's going on here? I know that people who are maybe a little more speculative about Revelation than I tend to be, or that see Revelation as having more sort of coded language in it, can sometimes get really caught up on Babylon and where is that today and what nations are there today and what are they doing. But Babylon in the New Testament, and even in the later Old Testament, always was kind of a symbol first and foremost. Not that it didn't exist, but Babylon is in Revelation a sort of mean name for Rome. It's a derogatory term given to Rome, but more broadly, in all of the New Testament and in the later bits of the Old Testament, Babylon is a symbol that kind of stands in for all big global powers that are broadly opposed to God's will. Um, you might remember, if you've read Second Kings lately or Second Chronicles, that Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, was the empire that invaded Judah and sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and carried the people of Jerusalem away into slavery back in Babylon. It's a really dramatic and traumatic part that a lot of the Old Testament narratives kind of build up to, that starting all the way back in like Samuel, when the history of Israel first starts to get narrated as one nation after Judges, um, God is consistently warning the people that if they're not faithful, he will let their neighbors come up and overtake them and remove them from the promised land, right? As you read the books of Moses and all that, you see God telling the people, I'm coming to put you into this land, but the your status as these people in this promised land is conditional. And the prophets that he sends later on are going to keep warning the people that if you commit idolatry, if you keep not worshiping Yahweh, if you keep being oppressive towards the poor, that status can be revoked. That I'll bring a nation up to come and displace you from the land that I've given you. And the books of Kings and Chronicles are structured around this so that their high kind of dramatic climax is when that happens. That for the writers of the Old Testament, God's biggest, most major judgment on Israel is Babylon, when he allows the Babylonians to come, to break into Jerusalem, to destroy and ransack the temple, and to carry the people of Jerusalem out and back to Babylon. Um, and you can remember probably different points from this, like the book of Daniel, remember, is Daniel and his friends are captives that were in Jerusalem when the sack happened, and they got carted back to Babylon, and that's why they're there right now. But Babylon didn't last. You can read the prophet Habakkuk's not one we look at a lot, but I really like it, where the book of Habakkuk is this prophet asking God how it's just to allow this immoral, pagan, evil nation to take them over. That how is that actually justice to let this evildoer overcome us? And God says, I've raised Babylon up to judge you, but I'll judge Babylon in my own time. Don't you worry about it. And of course, Babylon did fall not terribly long after it destroyed Jerusalem. The Persian Empire actually overtook Babylon. It's an interesting story to look at. They actually did it more or less bloodlessly when they actually got there. The people of Babylon kind of revolted and declared themselves Persians when the Persian Empire came. And then when the Persian Empire overtook Babylon, the Persians sent the Jews back into the promised land and gave them some money to rebuild the temple. But all that to say, because of that experience of Babylon being the group that destroyed Jerusalem, that destroyed the temple, but that then God ultimately judged and brought up another nation to take over, um, Babylon became a symbol for the Jewish people of evil empires opposed to the will of God. And so it's not surprising at all that Rome gets called Babylon here. It brings up an image of a people oppressing God's people who will inevitably be thrown down and destroyed for what they're doing. And so that's going to be why soon the beast becomes Babylon, or the woman Babylon, or the prostitute Babylon. But we get with this that he sees a woman, an angel comes out and cries out, "Fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations drink the wine of the wrath of her fornication." That's a weird, kind of hard little statement that has there. It's kind of a little bit of a complicated military metaphor happening. But in short, what is being said here is that Rome is enticing all the nations and all the people in the nations of the world to join Rome in its oppressive, evil behavior. The image of Rome here, or like Rome as Babylon, is that it's being compared to an adulteress plying people with alcohol to get them to sleep and commit adultery with her, is what he's saying is happening here. That Babylon is like someone, an adulteress plying people with alcohol. But the image is that Rome is offering people things in exchange for evil. That Rome is offering security and prosperity and opportunity, but only for those who are willing to engage in idolatry and abuse. We're going to see in a few chapters that Amos will get to a little bit down the line, where John becomes very concerned with the ways that some of the nations that have aligned themselves with Rome are enslaving their people to get Rome goods, or taking from the poor in their jurisdictions to send back to Rome. We talked a few weeks ago about how famines would happen in parts of the Roman Empire because Rome would want to throw feasts to celebrate a new senator being elected or a new Caesar coming, and they would take so much, grain and fruits and cattle from different parts of the impoverished empire that people would starve to death. So fasting could happen over here in Rome. And this for John is a what he means when he says that Rome, or this woman Babylon, is enticing the world to commit adultery with her. That they're offering, we'll give you prosperity, we'll give you opportunity, but you have to engage in idolatry and abuse. I thought it was helpful the way that G.K. Beale, whose commentary I've been using, put this, to just read from him for a moment. The nation's cooperation with Rome ensures their material security. Without this cooperation, security would be removed. Such security is a temptation too great to resist. The phrase "made to drink" means that people must comply with society's demands in order to prosper. Once one imbibes, the intoxicating influence removes all desire to resist Babylon's destructive influence, blinds one to Babylon's own ultimate insecurity and to God as a source of real security, and numbs one from any fear of a coming judgment. So, this image comes up where the angel says that just like Babylon has plied the world with alcohol, God will give the world judgment to drink. God will give the people, sort of their just desserts. What has happened to them will be kind of visited back on them. It'll be given back to the beast and all the people who are marked with the beast. And I want to say again to remember that the mark isn't like a one-time choice that a person can take or not take. It then is, that's it. You had your one chance. You took the mark. You're out. But the mark is a symbol for what one devotes themselves to. Everyone has to devote themselves to something. And you can, in Revelation's mind, devote yourself to the world, to the beast, to Rome. These are all one thing, to Caesar, to Satan, or to God. The beast declares itself the enemy of God and God's people. And so the beasts and the beast people, these people who dedicate themselves to the world, Revelation says, will be judged for that. You can't be neutral on it. You have to be with the lamb or with the beast. And everybody has consciously chosen. And Revelation says justice will be dealt out according to that. We get this little tag at the end where John is told to write, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on." And the Spirit says, "So they will rest from their labor since their works follow them." This can get misinterpreted sometimes as especially if you're thinking this is describing a single future bad thing to happen at some point later in time, is saying that it's better to die before whatever this is happens. But I think this is just a very basic assurance that eternal reward is guaranteed to those who are faithful to the Lamb, whether they die before they see it or not. That you can remember from books like Thessalonians that a lot of the first Christians were afraid that if they died before Jesus came back, that would be it. That they would miss it. They would not get their reward. And so John is just sort of clarifying here that those who die are not going to miss their reward. That when a person dies, they go to be with the Lord and receive the reward for their faithfulness. And then we have a final image kind of complementing this and bringing the first two together. And this image of a harvest that starts in 14. So, and I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, "Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And then another angel came out to the altar, the angel who had authority over fire. And he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Use your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung its sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. So in this last vision, John sees basically two angels going out to do two harvests. And this is maybe already sounding a little bit familiar, at least. Jesus talked a lot about harvests and had parables about harvests. And it's usually a positive thing, especially in the Gospels, which makes sense. A harvest in the ancient world is a cause for celebration. Most festivals happen around it. Um, you've worked all year for some crop that's finally coming in, and now you have food and security with that. And that is what's happening with this first one here. So an angel comes out and is told to swipe its sickle over the earth and reap something like grain, is kind of what's being set up here in this one, and to gather what it's reaped and bring it back to the Lamb, back to this Son of Man with the gold crown in the temple. But then another harvest happens where this time, instead of wheat, where you're using a scythe to get the grain heads, now grapes are being picked up, and then the grapes are put into a press and trampled onto. It's in this sort of dual image where you have a kind of good reaping and a bad reaping, but everybody's getting reaped one way or another. So the time to judge the world has come. This is the final judgment played out like it's a field being reaped. And some of the stuff is brought to the Lord, some of it's just sort of taken and brought to Christ, and some of it is taken and put into a press and trampled on, so that blood flows out of the press. And it's an interesting sort of dual image here, where one thing happens to all of the world is reaped, all of the world is harvested. But depending on kind of what you are there, it's either good or bad. The same action is really good for some people. It's blessed, eternity with God for some people. And it's judgment and damnation for another people. It makes me think of an image I really like from Anselm of Canterbury, a really influential Christian theologian and thinker from kind of the early medieval period. And he talks in one of his books, I can't remember which one, about how God's disposition towards the world is like the sun. He says that we hope this is not too complicated, but he says that we humans often think of God as having emotions like love and anger, or we think of God doing different types of things at different times, but to some degree, God sort of just is to the world, and it's our relationship to God that determines sort of what God's disposition is. And so he says it's like The sun, if you're standing on the beach on a nice spring day, the sun is a really, really pleasant thing. If you're standing in Death Valley in the middle of July, that same sun is doing the same thing, but it's not good for you anymore. And if you're standing on the surface of Mercury, the sun is going to destroy you. The sun is going to be unbearable to you. And he says, the sun doesn't change. The sun didn't decide, I'm going to burn this guy and I'm going to sunburn this guy, but I'm going to be nice and warm for this guy. It's the person and their place that affects how their sort of relationship to God is. And in some ways, it's a really helpful way to think, and in some ways, maybe less so. But that's kind of what I think the image is here, that um, people have decided kind of if they're wheat or grape. They put themselves into these different categories. And one of those things is gathered to God, and one of those things is trampled and destroyed. And it's really, honestly, violent, kind of hyperbolic, symbolic image of blood coming up in the streets. Um, but it's the same thing one way or another. The world is judged, and for some people that's good, and for some people that's bad. And so I wanted to end here by talking about this as kind of the point of these three visions. And as I'm getting ready to kind of go on break teaching here for a little bit, kind of a point of a lot of revelation up to here. And that is that God at the end of history is going to make sure the world is just, that we can count certainly on whatever happens in the course of human events, whatever happens in history, whatever happens in our lives, an absolute certainty, a surety, is that God will bring justice, that God will set things right. At the end of history, at the culmination of everything, God is going to make certain that good is rewarded and that evil is punished and destroyed. And so it becomes key, and Revelation exhorts us constantly that we need to be the kind of people that that's a good thing for, that it's ultimately assured that history will end up just, that good will be rewarded and evil punished. And in light of that, we need to think about and constantly wonder about the types of people we are and whether or not it's good for us that that's going to be the case. But he exhorts us and says, if we follow Christ, we're the type of person for whom that's going to be good. We're the type of person that looks forward to that. But that's why he says we have to constantly remain faithful, is because no matter how momentarily advantageous evil or wrongdoing might look, God will set everything right. God is setting everything right, and we need to put our entire lives gathered around that fact. That has to be how we organize the way we think about ourselves and others and the world. We want to be the type of people that justice is a good thing for. So that will transition to questions, just sort of discussion time. But thank you guys again. I've really enjoyed amount of time been able to do this. It's been a very good discussion so far. So just thank you for all for joining along with this.